The Syrian desert was quiet that morning, almost unnaturally so. The sun had barely begun its climb, painting the sand dunes a muted orange, when the sirens shattered the calm. Alarm bells blared across Shirat Air Base, echoing against the concrete hangars and the rows of Soviet-supplied MiGs lined up on the tarmac. This was no routine drill. Every pilot and mechanic knew at the instant the sirens screamed, something unthinkable was approaching. Inside the radar station, a young Syrian operator stared at the screen, eyes wide. Blips moved across the display with a precision he had never seen. He shook, whispering to himself in disbelief. Not a mirage, not a phantom, something else, faster, perfect. Colonel Borodin, the Soviet advisor overseeing the base, stepped up behind him. His cigarette fell from his lips as he studied the display, a chill running down his spine. He didn't need the operator to confirm. He already knew. F-15 Eagles, he muttered, voice low, almost unsteady. The F-15, the aircraft the Soviet Union had studied in secret, feared, and respected. Sleek, fast, technologically superior, a predator built to dominate any airspace. And now it was here. In the skies they were sworn to defend. The base erupted into controlled chaos. Mechanics ran between the jets, shouting instructions. Fuel hoses hissed. Engines thundered to life. The MiG-23MLs gleamed under the floodlights, their swing wings ready to slice the desert air. Major Viktor Myrishkin, veteran of dozens of sorties and countless mock engagements against Western aircraft, climbed into his cockpit. His hands were steady, but inside, his heart hammered. He had faced Israeli Phantoms, French Mirages, even F-4s in joint exercises, but he had never seen the likes of this. Lieutenant Ivan Chernov, his young wingman, climbed in after him. The radio crackled as Colonel Borodin's voice came through. Alpha flight, launch immediately. Observe and do not provoke. Understood? Yes, Comrade Colonel, Victor replied, gripping the throttle. The MiGs surged down the runway, tires screeching, engines screaming, dust and sand swirling behind them. Lift off. The desert fell away beneath them, replaced by a canvas of blue and white clouds. Altitude climbed. Speed climbed. Adrenaline surged. Then they saw them. 4 F-15 Eagles, slicing through the sky with terrifying elegance. Their formation was flawless, each jet perfectly spaced, perfectly level, perfectly controlled. It was more than flying, it was choreography. The Soviet pilots tried to maneuver, but the Eagles matched them effortlessly. Every turn, every dive, every climb was mirrored before it could even begin. Chernov's voice trembled in the headset. Major, they're too fast, too precise. Victor didn't answer immediately. His eyes were glued to the Eagles. His training screamed at him, engage, climb, outmaneuver. But logic told him it was impossible. He realized with a sinking feeling, they were already dominated. The lead Eagle tilted its nose slightly. No missiles fired. No gun tracked. Nothing. Just a simple, controlled movement that said one thing. I can destroy you whenever I choose. I am superior. One by one, the other Eagles executed subtle rolls and adjustments, each one reinforcing the same message. The MiGs attempted to respond, to match, to close the distance, but the F-15s anticipated every maneuver. The air itself seemed under their control, bending to their will. Chernov gasped, voice shaking. They're mocking us. They're not even engaging. They're showing us they can do anything. The Eagles executed a slow climb and pulled away, ascending like kings of the sky. Their afterburners lit the clouds in a flash of silver light, then vanished from sight. The MiGs were left floating in the thin desert air, engines whining, hearts pounding, minds reeling. When they returned to the base, no one celebrated. No cheers, no high-fives. Only silence. Mechanics looked at the pilots with worried eyes. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel and fear. Victor climbed down from his cockpit, legs shaking despite himself. Chernov didn't even look at him, he simply collapsed on the tarmac. Colonel Borodin surveyed the scene. His voice was steady but carried the weight of disbelief. Report. How did it go? Victor exhaled, struggling for composure. They could have destroyed us at will. Every move we made, they anticipated it. They didn't even fire a missile, and we're broken. Chernov finally spoke, voice hollow. They flew like the sky belonged to them. And we didn't. The sun rose fully, casting a harsh glare across the desert. But for the pilots returning, the sky felt smaller, colder, unwelcoming. The F-15 Eagles had arrived. The era of unquestioned Soviet air superiority had ended, and everyone knew it. Even before the first missile had been fired, the Soviets had learned their most painful lesson. They were no longer masters of the skies. The F-15 Eagles were. And in that moment silence fell, not the calm of peace, but the heavy, suffocating silence of defeat without battle. The first encounter had shattered confidence. Now, the Soviet pilots at Shayrat and other forward bases knew the Americans could return at any moment. By mid-morning, their worst fears were realized. Radar screens lit up like Christmas trees. 4 F-15s were inbound again, moving faster than any aircraft the Soviet pilots had trained against. Their altitude, speed, and formation precision were perfect, a textbook of aerial superiority written in real time. "Comrade Colonel, they're coming again," stammered a young radar officer, eyes wide. Borodin's expression was grim. He didn't even need to look at the screen. "They didn't fire yesterday, now they will decide if we even deserve the sky," he muttered. On the tarmac, MiG-23s and MiG-25s were being readied for scramble. Every pilot knew what was expected: intercept, observe, and survive. But deep down, they feared the inevitable humiliation. Their jets were fast, maneuverable, and deadly on paper, but nothing they had flown could match the Eagles. Major Viktor Myrishkin climbed into his MiG-25. His visor reflected the sunlight like steel. He adjusted the ejection handle, a nervous tick he hadn't needed in years. His wingman, Captain Ivan Chernov, was beside him, silent, staring into the desert sky. The airfield roared as the engines ignited, shaking the tarmac. Dust and gravel flew like a storm as the two MiGs accelerated into the air. The climb to intercept altitude was tense. Victor's radar lit up almost immediately. The blips weren't slow-moving. They were deliberate, controlled, and deadly precise. The Eagles were not here to engage in a dogfight. They were here to demonstrate dominance. As the MiGs approached, the F-15s executed maneuvers that made the Soviet jets seem clumsy in comparison. A simple roll, a shallow climb, a precision turn, each move demonstrated total control. Victor tried to predict their flight path, but every calculation failed. The Eagles were always one step ahead, always controlling the engagement. Chernov's voice trembled over the radio. They're showing us, we can't fight them." Victor didn't respond. Words couldn't convey what he felt, all mixed with fear, the paralyzing knowledge that no amount of training or bravery could match this enemy in the air. One of the F-15s descended slightly, forcing the MiGs into a defensive climb. The move was subtle, almost casual, but it spoke volumes. Victor realized with a cold chill, the Americans didn't need weapons to dominate. Their presence alone dictated the battle. Suddenly, radar warnings screamed, "Missile lock." Not an actual missile, just a simulated lock designed to demonstrate control. Victor pulled the MiG into an aggressive climb, flares streaming behind him, but it was pointless. The Eagles weren't engaging. They were testing, mocking, and teaching a brutal lesson. Chernov banked sharply to the right, trying to break the lock, but the F-15 adjusted its climb, mirroring his movements flawlessly. The MiGs felt like toys being pushed around by invisible hands. Minutes passed like hours. The Eagles executed a series of maneuvers that pushed the MiGs to their operational limits. Every roll, every dive, every turn revealed one simple truth: they were outclassed. Outmatched. Outflown. Then, without warning, the Eagles climbed and vanished into the upper atmosphere. No shots fired, no missiles launched. The MiGs were left floating, engines whining, hearts racing, minds reeling. Back at the airbase, the pilots returned in silence. No one celebrated. No one spoke. The air smelled of burned fuel and something heavier, fear. Victor climbed down, legs trembling. Chernov sat on the tarmac, visor still down, shaking. Colonel Borodin surveyed them, his voice quiet but heavy. Report. Victor exhaled, voice barely audible. They didn't fire. They didn't need to. They control the sky, and we don't. Chernov finally spoke. They're perfect. Every movement, every turn, they predicted us before we even moved. The sun climbed higher, but the desert sky no longer felt theirs. The MiGs had survived, yes, but the lesson was complete. The F-15 Eagles weren't just superior aircraft. They were harbingers of a new era in aerial warfare. Soviet pilots had flown against the best of the West before, but this was different. This wasn't combat. This was a demonstration of total, unchallenged air superiority. And in that moment, every pilot knew their world had changed. The sky belonged to the Eagles, and the Soviet Union had been reminded of its limits in the most terrifying way imaginable. The Arctic morning dawned cold and gray over Siberia, but there was no warmth for the pilots stationed at Tixi and Inadir airbases. The previous encounters with the F-15 Eagles had left them shaken, their confidence fractured like ice underfoot. And now, reports poured in. More American jets were approaching, cutting across Soviet-controlled skies as if they owned them. Colonel Yuri Markov, commander of the Far Eastern Air Command, stared at the radar screens. His jaw tightened as he read the blips moving in perfect formation. They weren't erratic. They weren't probing. They were precise. Controlled. Dominant. Altitude, 17,000 meters. Speed, exceeding projections, whispered a radar operator, voice trembling. Markov's hand brushed against the console. Prepare the interceptors, he said slowly. MiG-25s only. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Observation only. But the word observation felt hollow. Every pilot present understood what this meant in reality. They were about to face an enemy capable of dictating the sky. The Soviet scramble. Major Sokolov and Captain Valery Antonov sprinted across the icy tarmac to their MiG-25s. Snow swirled violently around them, whipped by the roar of jet engines and the blast of afterburners from other aircraft. Their hands were steady, but their hearts were not. Both men had seen the Eagles before, twice, but fear had a way of returning like a shadow. Foxbat 1 and Foxbat 2 airborne, radioed ground control. The MiGs ascended through the freezing Siberian air, reaching stratospheric altitudes where oxygen thinned and pressure threatened every heartbeat. Above them, the Eagles waited, almost as if the air itself bent to their will. Sokolov's eyes widened. The Americans were climbing in perfect synchronization, their V-formation tight, precise. Each aircraft seemed to anticipate the Soviet movements before they even began. They're everywhere, Sokolov whispered to himself, voice barely audible under his helmet. Antonov's voice quivered in the comms. Major, they're mocking us. They don't need to chase. They don't need to attack. They're showing us we cannot win. The psychological trap. The Eagles descended slightly, baiting the MiGs into higher climb angles. It was subtle, almost invisible, but enough to force Sokolov and Antonov to expend fuel, stress their engines, and push themselves to physical limits. Warning alarms flared. A white streak appeared in Victor's peripheral vision, a Sparrow missile, launched in demonstration only, cutting through the thin air. It didn't strike, but the message was clear: we can hit you anytime, anywhere. Sokolov banked sharply, redlining the Foxbat engines, flares erupting behind him. Antonov tried to dive out of the path, but the Eagle formation adjusted seamlessly, cutting off every escape vector. The Soviet pilots realized the truth: this was not a fight. It was a lesson in control. One Eagle dove sharply, positioning itself directly above Sokolov. Its shadow fell over the cockpit like a hammer. The altitude, the angle, the visibility, it was perfect. A strike could have come at any second. But it didn't. This wasn't an attack. It was demonstration. Eagle's superiority in action. The F-15s rolled, banked, and climbed in a deadly choreography, forcing the MiGs into extreme maneuvers. Every move Sokolov made was anticipated. Every action Antonov took was mirrored or countered. Minutes passed, each one stretching into eternity. The MiG pilots' muscles ached, their lungs burned, their minds raced. And still, the Eagles maintained perfect control, never firing a weapon. "Foxbat 2, they're above us again," Sokolov reported, voice tight. Antonov swallowed hard. "It's not the missiles, it's their presence. They are dominating everything. Every inch of sky, every maneuver. They own it." The Eagles then climbed in unison, disappearing into thin cloud layers. Their afterburners left trails of silver in the stratosphere, a stark reminder of their dominance. Return to base. Sokolov and Antonov descended toward base in silence. Their Foxbats were intact, engines screaming, but their spirits were broken. Mechanics and commanders watched their return, sensing the fear in their posture. Colonel Markov approached. "Report," he demanded, eyes scanning their faces. "They didn't fire a single shot," Sokolov admitted, voice shaking. "And yet, they controlled everything. We couldn't do anything. Every move, every decision, they anticipated it." Antonov nodded, still pale. "They didn't just outfly us. They outthought us. They've made it clear, the sky belongs to them now." The sun rose fully over Siberia, but the warmth of day could not touch the pilots' frozen resolve. The lesson had been seared into their minds. F-15 Eagles were more than aircraft. They were a force that could dominate without engaging, a predator that controlled every inch of the sky. And in that moment, Soviet pilots understood a terrifying reality: their airspace was no longer theirs. The Arctic horizon was pale, almost empty, when the next alarm rang across Inadir and Magadan airbases. Radar screens lit up with 4 blips moving with uncanny precision. No hesitation. No erratic paths. The Americans were back. Colonel Viktor Lebedev, commander of the region, stared at the screens. His jaw tightened. "They're not probing," he muttered. "They're telling us something. And we better understand what before it's too late." 2 MiG-31 interceptors were prepped for scramble. Major Kirill Borodin and Captain Oleg Ruzanov, seasoned pilots, climbed into their cockpits with the weight of every previous encounter pressing down. The MiG's engines roared, sending tremors through the icy tarmac. They lifted off in unison, breaking through clouds into the unforgiving sky. The Eagles return. Above the clouds, the F-15 Eagles waited. 4 silhouettes glinted in the faint Arctic sunlight, perfectly spaced, perfectly controlled. No aggression. No error. Just pure dominance. Borodin tried to keep calm. "Keep formation," he instructed Ruzanov, though his own voice trembled slightly. He knew instinctively what no training could prepare them for: they were outclassed before a single missile had been fired. The Eagles didn't maneuver aggressively. They didn't need to. Their presence alone dictated the movement of the MiGs below. Every climb, every dive, every turn by the Soviet jets was anticipated and mirrored. Ruzanov's breathing became shallow. They're flying as one. Like a single mind." Borodin didn't answer. He didn't need to. He knew the truth: these Americans were controlling the fight before it began. The silent lesson. Then the lead eagle tilted slightly, a subtle move, but enough to force Borodin and Ruzanov into a defensive climb. Radar alarms flared. Missile lock warnings screamed. Yet no weapons were launched. Ruzanov panicked. "Lock! Lock! They're locking us!" Borodin's voice was steady, if tense. "No, this is worse, it's a demonstration. They don't need to fire. Every movement we make, they predict it. They are above us in every way." For 8 minutes, the F-15s maneuvered with calm precision, mirroring and countering the MiGs at every step. The Soviet pilots pushed their aircraft to the limits. Engines screamed. Flares erupted. But nothing worked. Finally, the Eagles climbed rapidly, disappearing into the thin upper atmosphere. The MiGs were left suspended, engines whining, hearts pounding. No shots fired. No missiles. And yet, The lesson was devastatingly clear. The F-15s controlled the sky. Return to base. When Borodin and Rozanov returned, silence reigned at the airbase. Mechanics watched the pilots disembark, legs shaking, eyes hollow. The base commander asked quietly, "Were they fired upon?" Borodin shook his head. "No, worse than that. They controlled every aspect of the fight. We didn't just survive. We were outclassed, outflown, outthought." Rozanov removed his helmet slowly, his voice low. "I've flown against the best Soviet pilots, the best aircraft, and yet today, I felt like a trainee. They didn't need to attack. They simply showed us we were inferior." The sun rose fully over the Arctic, but it brought no warmth. The MiG pilots had survived, yet they understood a new reality. The sky no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the Eagles. The psychological impact. In the weeks that followed, reports from bases across the Soviet Far East were unanimous. Pilots were returning from sorties visibly shaken. Even the most experienced felt humiliated. Technical superiority had always been measured by aircraft performance, missile range, and pilot skill. But the F-15s had proven that psychological dominance alone could dictate the outcome of any engagement. It wasn't the missiles, or the guns, or even aerial maneuvers that had defeated the Soviets. It was the knowledge that their enemy was always one step ahead. Every decision, every climb, every turn, predicted, anticipated, nullified. For the first time, Soviet pilots truly feared the skies. Not because of destruction, but because they were no longer in control. Borodin, sitting alone in the base mess hall, whispered to himself, "They didn't fight us. They didn't need to. They taught us a lesson that will last decades. The sky, it belongs to them now." And somewhere, high above in the stratosphere, the F-15 Eagles continued their patrol, silent, precise, untouchable. The Soviets had learned an unbreakable truth: air superiority could be absolute, and the Americans had claimed it. The Arctic night was black as obsidian, stretching endlessly over frozen Siberian tundra. Above in Nadir and Tixi, radar screens flickered with life, 4 precise blips, approaching at impossible speed. The F-15 Eagles had returned. This time, it wasn't daylight. The Americans had chosen night, a deliberate, psychological escalation. Soviet pilots knew it instinctively. The Eagles didn't need visibility to dominate. They were confident enough to hunt in the dark. The midnight scramble. Lieutenant Viktor Chernov and Senior Lieutenant Pavel Ryzenko were assigned to intercept. Both were young, capable, and ambitious, yet they felt a deep, unshakable dread. The sirens screamed across the base as they sprinted to their MiG-29s. Engines roared to life, snow swirling violently as afterburners lit the icy air. "Foxbat 1 and Foxbat 2 airborne!" crackled the control tower. The MiGs sliced into the night sky, climbing toward radar contacts that glimmered faintly in instrument panels. Visibility was limited, clouds obscured the stars. But the Eagles moved with impeccable precision, cutting across the darkness as if they could see everything below, above, and beyond. Chernov's pulse raced. "Do they know we're here?" he whispered, gripping the throttle. "Yes," Ryzenko replied quietly. "And they're already controlling everything." First contact in darkness. The Eagles approached in perfect formation, yet made no aggressive moves. Then, subtle flashes of light, navigation strobes toggled on and off, appeared at irregular intervals. Chernov's heart skipped. "They're testing us," he said. Radar alarms suddenly shrieked, missile lock warnings, electronic signals, false but terrifyingly convincing. The MiGs lurched, pilots fighting to maintain control, muscles burning. "They don't need to fire," Ryzenko admitted over the radio. "Every move we make, they anticipate. We're trapped in their rhythm." The Eagles mirrored every maneuver, rising, diving, banking in perfect harmony. It was a psychological trap, executed without weapons, without aggression. The MiG pilots were on the defensive, reacting rather than acting, as the Eagles dictated the fight. The ghosts of the sky. Chernov's HUD suddenly lit up. One F-15 had materialized directly beside him. Wingtip to wingtip, silent, invisible in the darkness. His blood ran cold. The Eagle's pilot didn't need to speak, their presence alone sent a message. I see you. I control you. You survive only because I allow it. Ryzenko tried to maneuver out, but every adjustment was countered instinctively. The Eagles weren't just flying, they were manipulating the MiGs, bending the fight to their will. Alarms sounded again, another radar lock, followed by a simulated missile approach. It wasn't real, yet it struck terror deep in the pilot's bones. The message was unmistakable: any mistake, any lapse in control, and destruction would follow. Psychological domination without firing. The Eagles performed a coordinated climb, disappearing into the clouds, leaving the MiGs exposed, exhausted, and terrified. No shots were fired. No missiles launched. And yet the Soviet pilots returned to base feeling defeated before combat even began. Mechanics rushed to the jets, expecting damage reports. Instead, they found two pilots shaking uncontrollably, visors fogged with sweat, unable to speak. Chernov whispered finally. They didn't even need to attack. They made us feel powerless, hunted. Ryzenko nodded silently, voice hollow. We survived. But it feels like the sky doesn't belong to us anymore. The aftermath. Word of the night intercept spread quickly through the Soviet Far East. Pilots who had faced Eagles before now refused voluntary sorties. Even the most experienced reported insomnia, nightmares, and an unshakable fear of the dark skies. The lesson was clear: superiority is not measured by missiles or maneuvers alone. It is measured by confidence, control, and psychological dominance. The Eagles didn't need to fire. They had already achieved complete air supremacy. In the mess halls and barracks, one sentiment was unanimous. The sky belongs to them. And we are merely visitors. As the Arctic night stretched on, the four F-15s patrolled unseen, untouchable, and flawless, the predators of the dark, leaving the Soviets to ponder a terrifying new reality. The airspace they once controlled was no longer theirs to command. The Arctic dawn was gray, brittle, and merciless. Snow stretched endlessly below, jagged and unyielding, as if the world itself braced for what would come. And above, in the silent heavens, the F-15 Eagles reigned supreme. For weeks, Soviet pilots had endured humiliation, fear, and the impossible, facing an enemy who controlled the skies without firing a single shot. Radar reports confirmed it. Every encounter, every flight, every intercept attempt had ended the same way. The Eagles dominated, predicted, and humiliated them. Colonel Andrei Morozov, Far Eastern Air Command, stared at the radar display. Four blips, moving with flawless synchronization, were crossing the Kamchatka Strait. This was no routine patrol. This was a lesson in mastery. Scramble all available MiGs. Observe. Do not engage, he commanded. His voice was calm, but inside, every officer knew the truth. The Soviets were about to confront their own limits. The final intercept. Major Viktor Myryshkin and Captain Ivan Chernov were assigned to lead the intercept. Their MiG-31s roared into the sky, engines screaming against the Arctic wind. Clouds whipped around them, ice forming on canopies and control surfaces, but the Eagles waited. As they climbed, the F-15s descended slightly, baiting the MiGs into higher altitudes. Every Soviet maneuver was countered effortlessly. Every turn, dive, and roll mirrored, anticipated, nullified. Myryshkin's pulse raced. They know exactly what we're going to do before we do it. Chernov's voice trembled. It's not the missiles, it's their control. They've already won. Total psychological dominance. The Eagles performed synchronized rolls, climbs, and dives, each move calculated to exhaust, intimidate, and dominate. Flares erupted from the MiGs. Radar alarms screamed simulated missile locks. But no weapons were fired. The Americans didn't need to. Their presence alone dictated the engagement. One F-15 moved alongside Myryshkin's MiG, wingtip to wingtip, silent and precise. The shadow of the Eagle fell across the cockpit like a hammer. It was a predator asserting dominance without aggression. Chernov tried to maneuver out of formation, but the Eagle mirrored every move. It was no longer an aircraft versus aircraft, it was a mental battle, a contest of nerves, reflexes, and control. The final lesson. Minutes stretched into eternity. The Eagles climbed rapidly, leaving the MiGs suspended, engines straining, hearts racing. The lesson was devastatingly clear. Soviet pilots had survived, but the sky no longer belonged to them. When they landed, silence greeted them. Mechanics and commanders looked at the pilots' pale faces. Not a single word was spoken. They had been broken without a shot being fired. Borodin whispered, "They didn't fight us. They didn't even need to. They taught us a lesson we'll never forget. The sky, it belongs to them now." Myryshkin nodded, voice hollow. "It's not just aircraft. It's strategy, control, and precision. We were outclassed in every way." The legacy of the Eagles. Across the Soviet Far East, reports poured in from every base. Pilots refused voluntary sorties. Even the most seasoned were haunted by the knowledge that their best aircraft and training were not enough. The F-15s had proven a terrifying truth: air superiority is not only measured by weapons, but by control, psychology, and precision. In the Arctic sky, the Eagles continued their patrol, unseen, untouchable, flawless. The Soviets had survived, but they had learned the ultimate lesson in dominance. The era of unquestioned Soviet air superiority was over. The sky had been conquered. Not by missiles, not by guns, but by perfection in motion and the confidence to dominate. And in that moment, every pilot understood a chilling fact. No aircraft, no training, and no courage could challenge them. The F-15 Eagles had claimed the heavens. And for the first time in decades, the Soviet Union realized the future of aerial warfare had arrived, and they were already behind.